Hello, thank you so much for the warm welcome. Thank you for being here. Thanks so much for having me. I am so excited to talk with you tonight. I love what all the speakers I've heard tonight have said, but I loved what Dr. Moeller said about Christians in particular knowing what time it is. Knowing what time it is in this moment in history, confidently knowing that God has not placed any of us or our kids or your grandkids here when and where he has arbitrarily or accidentally, but that each of us occupies the tiny speck of eternity that we do on purpose. God has placed us here purposely and providentially to enlighten and to bring clarity to and to bring what is good and right and true to every sphere that we occupy. Now, you guys know that there are people in the church, in the global church, in the American church, maybe even in your local church, who believe that politics is beneath the Christian, that culture wars are something to be derided, something to be condescended, something to look down upon, that really we shouldn't get down in the muck and the mire, that we shouldn't dirty ourselves with these social issues, these divisive issues. We've heard this a lot, especially over the past few years, and yet Christians that know what time it is know the necessity in engaging in the political sphere. Christians are called to engage what is typically derided as the culture wars. And that engagement doesn't represent or doesn't look like a friendship, but rather mirrors more closely a warlike engagement. You may have heard President Biden, as Dr. Perkins said earlier, refer to people who disagree with him, to conservatives, as a threat to the republic, a threat to democracy. Those are really hefty words. And make no mistake, when Biden says that people on the other side of the aisle are a threat, he is not just talking about a small group of fringe extremists. He is talking about everyone who opposes him and his politics. He is talking about pro-lifers. He is talking about people that oppose gender ideology. He is talking about the parents who go to school board meetings to oppose, say, the pornography that is being shown to their 7th graders in school. He is talking about Christians. He is talking about you and me. When Joe Biden says that we are a threat to democracy, I think a lot of us, understandably, get defensive. We're incredulous. You're talking about us, the people who live our lives in very ordinary ways, sometimes mundane ways and peaceful ways, who just care about our families, whose weeks are filled with parenting and grandparenting and going to work and going to church and helping our neighbors who are just trying to be responsible citizens. What? We are a threat? How can we possibly be a threat? We're not a threat. But I don't think that's the right answer, even though I think it's an understandable response. Because of course, you're right. You are not a violent threat to the United States, but you are absolutely a threat to the ideology that our current culture and this administration represents. You are a threat. Just by nature of being a Christian, you are a threat to secular progressivism. Christian theology fundamentally is a threat. It is a threat to evil. It is a threat to lies. It is a threat to unjust policy. It is a threat to oppression. It is a threat to tyrants. So Joe Biden is not right on very many things, but he is right on that. That you are a threat to the ideology that he represents. And this is not new. The threat that we pose to this kind of destructive ideology that we are seeing played out in our culture, that we are seeing made manifest through this administration and through many politicians and entities, institutions in this country, the threat that we represent to that progressive power is not really new. We are simply just being the same kind of Christians that Christians throughout history have been. Christians have always been a boil on the back of dictators. Christians have always been an obstacle to tyrants. Christians have always been a hindrance to the Nazis, to the communists, to the Marxists. We have always been in the way of evil totalitarians, and we still carry that torch today. So own that. Own that you are a threat to the progressive regime that dominates all of our national institutions, that dominates the federal government right now, that dominates our intelligence agencies in many ways, that dominates our public education system, academia, big tech, the mainstream media, and even dominates many global institutions like the UN. You are a threat to these entities because you oppose their ideology. You are a threat to gender ideology. You are a threat to the communist indoctrination in our schools. You are a threat to abortion. You are a threat to every person in power who seeks to prey upon the minds and bodies of the defenseless. And I know it might seem sometimes like the country is only going to hell in a handbasket, that things are only going to get worse and worse, that we are only hurtling towards despair and destruction. But keep in mind that Christians who knew the power that they hold in Christ, who knew their responsibility to try to shape the world around them in a way that is good and right and true, Christians who recognized that they were a threat to the people in power that hold and wield this destructive and deadly ideology, helped overturn Roe v. Wade. So, do not believe just because things seem so dark and they seem so upside down and they seem so backwards. Do not think that things cannot change for the better. Remember, Roe v. Wade wasn't overturned after one election cycle, after a few months of activism, after a viral social media post. Roe v. Wade was overturned after almost 50 years, plus, really. You could really say it's been the entire history of the church pushing, advocating for laws that protect the most vulnerable. We're talking 50 years at least, of Christian pro-lifers lobbying, advocating, protesting, pushing back, standing up, speaking out for the things, for the people that matter. 50 years of relentless pushback, of persecution, of being lied about, people like Elizabeth Warren maligning their work that they do in pregnancy centers as somehow scary or manipulative when we know who is telling the lie, and it's Planned Parenthood and abortion providers. So 50 years of being gaslit and lied to about what's really going on, and Christian pro-lifers recognized the holy threat they are to the abortion industry, and they kept going. And they held out hope that something can change, and they also knew that even if nothing changed, even if the politics didn't change, even if Roe v. Wade was never overturned, there are people who advocated on behalf of the unborn who didn't live to see the Dobbs decision published, who didn't live to see Roe v. Wade overturned, and they did what they did, not for the immediate gratification of seeing political change, but because they knew they were called to it as Christians. So the same thing is true for us today. God, in his mercy, has given us this amazing, blessed example of what it looks like for Christians to be a threat to destructive and deadly policy in the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So the work that Christians do today, the advocacy that we do, speaking up for what is good and right and true, voting, putting the right people in office, all of the different ways that Christians get involved, we don't do it because of a guarantee of immediate outcomes, although of course we would love that. We would love for the things that we see as problems that we know are issues to change quickly, but we do it because it's obedience to God. We do it because it's right. And we do it with the hope that the grace of God will reap the consequences of our persistent work today in the lives and the lifetimes of our children and grandchildren. I know that there are Christians, there are people that you are friends with who don't want to talk about things like abortion, who don't want to talk about things like gender. Either they've just shut their minds and they've shut their eyes and ears to what's really going on. They don't want to see the evil that's happening. They don't want to believe it. They don't even really want to know what abortion is. They don't want to know how prevalent it is. They don't want to know that we have young girls and young boys going through genital mutilation procedures in the most prominent hospitals in our country. They just don't want to face it. And they really don't want to talk about it because they have convinced themselves that politics is beneath them, that it's divisive, that it's not loving, that it's not compassionate, that it's not empathetic to talk about abortion, to talk about gender ideology, to talk about the left-wing indoctrination in schools, to talk about destructive left-wing policies. Shouldn't we just not care about that? Shouldn't we just be going to church and sharing the gospel and loving people? Well, yes, of course we should be doing all of those things. And yes, of course, we know that one day every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Of course we know that Jesus is our only King. Of course we know that our citizenship is in heaven, but we are still here. We are still here. And we are not here for nothing. We're not here for nothing. We have to remember that while politics is not the only way to love our neighbor, and many times it's not even the primary way to love our neighbor, it is a way to love our neighbor. I like to say, because I love alliterations, politics matter because policy matters because people matter. Politics affects policy, policy affects people, and Christians know better than anyone that people matter. And policy always affects, primarily and disproportionately, the most vulnerable and the voiceless. Another saying that I often say on my podcast is that children are always the unconsenting subjects of progressive social experiments. Children are always the one placed on the altar of progressive social experiments. Whether you're looking at abortion, that's literal sacrifice, or whether you're looking at the gender ideology that is forcing them to change or think that they are changing their identities by mutilating their bodies, or whether you're even looking at COVID policy that robbed them of an education for 2 years and forced them into isolation, some of them to the point of death. Whether you're looking at the rearrangement of the family, forced motherlessness and fatherlessness, whether you're looking at unethical reproductive technologies, all of these are progressive social experiments that kids are being punished for. And something that Christians have always done since the inception of the church is provided refuge for children. If you look back at the beginning of the church, in the pagan world, there was not an understanding of children as a protected, vulnerable class. In fact, they very often were used and abused and exploited and objectified. It was Christians universalizing this idea over time that, one, human beings are made in the image of God. Therefore, they're not just clumps of matter. They're not just accidents. We're not just physical bodies, but we actually have a soul. We matter because of that. It matters what we do to people. It matters what we do to our own bodies. That idea alone revolutionized what people thought, not just about other people, but about marriage, but about sex. But also Christianity represented and introduced this radical idea of equality of worth through the gospel. That everyone is equally dead in our sin apart from Christ, as Ephesians 2 tells us. And everyone who is in Christ is equally alive by grace through faith in him. Those ideas of being made in the image of God and equally dead in sin apart from Christ and equally alive because of Christ, that radicalized or that revolutionized what people at the time thought about human beings, and in particular, the most vulnerable human beings, children. Christians throughout history have been a refuge for the most vulnerable, namely women and children. And when we are looking at the deadly effects of secular progressivism and the ideology that is being pushed on our children, pushed on the world today, we see that our role as Christians is the same as it has always been. And it is to be that refuge of safety, but also of clarity and truth. That is the gift that we are giving the world. When we say that there is only man, there is only woman. Marriage is between a man and a woman. Life inside the womb matters. All of these things we are told today are divisive political issues. They're culture war issues. No, for the Christian, they're biblical issues. And in fact, more specifically than biblical issues, they are Genesis 1 issues. They are Genesis 1:1 issues. The most controversial verse in the Bible is the first verse of the Bible, and that is God created the heavens and the earth. If you believe that, that changes everything, including your politics. Because if you believe that God created the heavens and the earth, he's not just the creator, he's the authority over all of it. He says what is and what isn't. He says what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad, what's true and what's false, what's male and what's female, what marriage is and what it's not. If he is the creator, he is the authority over all of it. And while the issues that are outlined in Genesis 1, that we are made in God's image, we are made male and female, he brings together male and female in holy matrimony. While these things today have become cultural and political, for the Christian, they are primarily theological. And so by simply holding fast to these fundamental truths, not just believing in them, but speaking them and living them out, you're not primarily being political, you're being a Christian. And if that makes you political, then so be it. And so, Christian, in every way that you can, in every sphere that you occupy, in every tiny speck of eternity on which God has purposely and providentially placed you, be a threat to evil. Be a threat to wickedness. Be a threat to propaganda and lies simply by being a Christian. Simply by representing and pushing for that which is good and right and true. Thank you so much.